belong to the Black Star resource owner
Well,
to maintain that.
In version 1, it didn't speak to it. Somewhere in the implementation plans for versions 2 and 3, and I don't exactly remember where, you now have a transmission owner who's got an asset, a substation, or a transmission cranking path, that's critical asset. And so you now have a newly discovered critical asset. There is an implementation plan now in the CIP standards that talks about, I think it's 24 months you've got to bring that asset within compliance. If you've got a program already set up and you've got other critical assets, I think it's 12 months you've got to bring that asset into compliance. If you've never been doing CIP standards, you've always gone through CIP 2 and you had no assets, and then somebody comes up and says, that substation you, Mr. Transmission Owner Operator, have, that is now a critical asset. You don't have a background checks or anything like that. You've got to build a whole program for the people that work out there. This works better in some regions than it does others because of the way the markets are structured and so forth. Any transmission facility that's operated at 500 kV or higher, transmission facilities that are operated at 300 kV or higher, or other substations interconnected with 3 or more transmission states will be critical assets. Again, these are pretty straightforward things. You know, you have engineering information, nameplate information. You know, you're not doing a risk-based assessment methodology. You're just now applying criteria. If you fall within the criteria, congratulations. If you're outside the criteria, business as usual. Yes, sir. This slide? Which number?
Why do you need number 6 based on number 7? Because you're saying 300 kV or higher.
Well, if you have a transmission facility that operates at 500 kV, period, or if you're in the 300 to 500 range and you've got 3 or more connections, so that's a lower level, but if you've got 3 or more connections, that brings you in. And you'll see in the new CIP 10 that's going to come out, when you talk about low, there'll be another category, medium and low into it. So there's going to be like a threshold of those building up to each other. Mike?
Yeah, so they are going to do a CIP 10?
Hmm?
They are going to do
Yeah,
a CIP?
I'm going to cover it in a second.
Oh,
I know.
I got another question on that other slide. Is it 300 kV plus it has to connect to 3 or more transmission stations?
Or
is it or? So, so
if you're 300 kV or higher, or you have interconnections with 3 or more other substations.
So why do they put the 500 kV?
500 is, if you have a substation that's 500 kV or above, that's it, it's in.
But if you have a substation that's 300 kV or above, it's in as well. Right, that's what I'm asking. You see what I'm saying? That significantly changes the scope of the...
I've kind of, go back and double check for sure.
Okay.
And make sure I haven't messed up. It's, because I kind of cleaned up a little bit what's in the standards. Yeah, yeah, both. So I messed that up, guys, sorry. Okay. Any transmission facility identified by the reliability coordinator, planning authority, or transmission planner as critical to the derivation of interconnection reliability operating limits, or IROLs. Flexible AC transmission systems, or FACS, that are identified by the RC, PA, or TP as critical to the derivation of IROLs. Transmission facilities that have destroyed, degraded, or misused, or otherwise rendered unavailable would result in the loss of assets identified by any generator as a CA through the application of Attachment 1. So if transmission facilities that support critical cyber assets tied back into criteria 1 and 3. If they're destroyed, misused, degraded, et cetera, would result in the loss of those assets being available. Because, you know, it's one thing to attack the generator and bring him down. It's another thing to attack the transmission system that supports that generator. So that's also tied in there. So again, this is an area where transmission operator owners are going to have to coordinate with generation asset owner operators. And it's going to be up to regional coordinators and reliability coordinators and planning authorities and balancing authorities, et cetera, to make those things happen smoothly. Transmission facilities identified as essential to meeting nuclear plant interface requirements. Special protection system, SPS, and remedial action schemes, like we talked about before, that if destroyed, degraded, or misused, otherwise rendered unavailable, would cause one or more interconnection reliability operating limit violations. And then automatic load shedding. And this it gets a little more complex than what it was before. Used to be you had to consider any facility capable of shedding 300 megawatts of load. Now it's automatic load shedding that performs load shedding without human intervention of 300 megawatts or more, and that's for either under voltage load shedding or under frequency load shedding. There was a lot of discussion about that because we spent days haggling over the terminology there. But that's what it finally turned out to be. And I refer you to probably almost 2,000 pages of industry comments that were received about this after this was published. And they went back through and addressed in comments. In a couple of cases, they made some minor wording changes to the final thing that went forward for that last vote. Sir?
In terms of, obviously we talked earlier about smart grid and, you know, the dynamics of a demand response system where, you know, you decide to create a demand response event, but then from there it's sort of a chain reaction to say, you know, based on this formula, based on these criteria, these loads, which may be an individual appliance in the house, get shed. Would that fall under that definition of an automatic load shed?
No, we're talking more about the systems that would exist at the distribution level provider doing that, or a load serving entity, depending on how you're structured in your market. There was one discussion, too, on the applicability of the new CIP 2 version 4. It started out, as did CIP 10, which was presented to the industry way back when, before the workshop, that we had distribution provider listed in the affected entities. That was removed because we didn't want to add that at this time. The next iteration of the standards, version 5, will probably include the distribution providers in there, just like the transmission providers are. So that's coming. If you're a reliability coordinator operating a control center or a backup control center, you're in. That's the way it is today. That's the way it's going to stay. That's where I get caught. Generation control center or backup control center used to control generation for multiple plant locations for any generation facility or group of generation facilities identified in criteria 1, 3, and 4 above, et cetera, or a generation control facility or backup control facility used to control generation equal to or exceeding 1,500 megawatts in a single interconnection. Now, you're saying who would get caught, or how would this apply? First of all, think in terms of some of your big companies now that have assets scattered over, say, 11 states and 4 different regions and 2 interconnections. And I can think of one based out of Columbus, Ohio, for example, that's got assets like that. You know, they're struggling right now to figure out how to support regional auditors from like 4 different regions that come into their assets. And they got a generation control system, for example, that controls assets in ERCOT and assets in Western Interconnection, Western Interconnection and Eastern Interconnection. So, you know, some of the big guys, the way they run their control centers on the generation operation side, it's not even located inside our Texas footprint, but they're liable to being audited by ERCOT because they're controlling generation facilities in the ERCOT footprint, and they exceed 1,500 megawatts within our interconnection. And they also may have more than 1,500 megawatts in other interconnections. So they're going to get it from both sides. Transmission operators that control control centers or backup centers used to control at least one asset identified in criteria 2, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, or 12 above. So if anything is identified as a critical asset, the control center that supports that is a critical asset. Balancing authorities, same thing, criteria 1, 3, 4, 13 above, and balancing authority control centers or backup control centers that have control generation equal to or greater than an aggregate of 1,500 megawatts in a single interconnection. Again, the same thing as we saw up above. The way this was originally written, it said the control centers and backup control centers of the RCs, BAs, TOPs, and GOPs would be in. After it stayed that way for a long time, then toward the latter part of our discussions, somebody woke up and said, wait a minute, you know, we don't want to do that. And the first set of comments we got back from the industry, you're not going to believe this, but there are some liability coordinator, balancing authority, and TOPs out there that have the footprint of a county and might have 3,000 or 4,000 subscribers. But for whatever reasons, they have, in a legacy environment, they still retain RCBA TOP functions, and they're interconnected into the larger control centers, like in ERCOT, for example. They'd be located, interconnected into our control systems in Taylor and Austin. Same thing, you go up Southwest Power Pool, go into FERC, go into CERC, or not FERC, FRCC. You'll see there's lots of these small municipalities, and in some cases co-ops. And those folks took one look at CIP standards and said, wait a minute, we can't do all that stuff. Some portion of the CIP standards team basically weighed in and said, look, if you're going to run a control center that's interconnected via ICCP to all these other control centers, given principles of network computers talking to each other, you know, you're all running system high. It's table stakes. You got to be up at the high level security if you want to be interconnected to these people. The industry turned that down. It was reworded to what you see there. So if you're a small RC, BA, or TOP, or GOP, if you fall outside that criteria, you no longer, you do not have to be designated as a critical asset. I can't speak for other regions, other interconnections. In ERCOT, if you're not high, you're not interconnected to us via ICCP. That's not true in other regions. So I think in my mind, this is a major gap in the standards. And I've not been in the least bit hesitant to tell anybody and everybody about that. Unlike some of the folks in this room who have to worry about their bosses giving them a hard time, my bosses basically say, go out and advocate what's right for reliability and security. So I advocate that we need tighter controls in this area. Yes, sir. Yeah, let's say you got a small generation company. They've got a couple miles of transmission and some distribution stuff, and they're hooked up, of course, into the rest of the grid. And their control center they use to run that those functions goes back via ICCP links and AGC links to larger control centers for like the reliability coordinator and balancing authority for a region. And let's say they don't do as good a job of securing it, or they're not required to secure their systems as well. They don't have to have electronic security perimeters. They've got some of their operator workstations and things like that they use to operate their control center scattered throughout their enterprise network. People go out and they surf the web, they get emails, they get phished, and those workstations that they use are not hardened or consistent with anything like that. There's maybe no enterprise standard for hardening workstations. They don't have network surveillance and monitoring, et cetera, and they get hammered by, oh, let's say the advanced persistent threat. Advanced persistent threat is very good about extenuating or extending an attack from an initial location back through network resources and establishing footholds in other network entities. And I'm sure the commander here could probably give me a lot more examples, but we probably couldn't talk about it in this room. We are up in working in contested space. These standards reflect an old industry that's not really stepped up to say, we're in contested space. It's not up to me whether these will be approved. These are under FERC right now. I can guarantee you that there are people working at FERC now who used to be on the standards drafting team that sit side by side as we advocated these positions. They now work for FERC. So I expect we're going to see some changes in this area of the standards when it gets returned to us. But that's just me. Okay. CIP 2 timelines. It was approved by an 80% industry vote in December. It went to the Board of Trustees in January and approved. It went to FERC the first week of February. I don't exactly have the exact date. I was busy doing something else that first week of February down at ERCOT. We expect approval by FERC in anywhere from 3 to 6 months. So probably around the July timeframe. July being the start of the quarter. That means probably on the 30th of June they'll give it to us. And they'll give us back the order. And then 6 months from the time they return it, it becomes effective starting on the next quarter. So if they approve it in June, the 6-month counter for that standard to become effective would be January of 2015. what's the next year there, 12. Except we've got a kicker in there from the effective date, you didn't add 24 months before it has to be mandatory and enforceable. So 24 months, 36 months, somewhere along after that, somewhere in 2013, CIP 2 version 4 will become effective because of the 24-month implementation schedule. Why a 24-month implementation schedule? You're going out and identifying new cyber assets and new critical assets that'll be affected. You need time to bring those into compliance. So that's what the 24-month gap is for. If you got critical assets that were previously identified under CIP 2 version 3, they must remain compliant with CIP 2 version 3, or CIP 3 through 9 up until CIP 4 becomes effective. You have to show bookended documentation, et cetera, et cetera. So up until the time version 4 becomes effective, if you have an asset that's going to drop out, and I think there's going to be some entities that have assets that drop out now because they were included for now. The new criteria is, you know, they can say, well, I'm going to keep those as a critical asset anyway and be susceptible and liable for compliance. I don't know of any utility that's going to keep anything more than they absolutely have to in their compliance package, but it's possible some folks would do that. So you got to bookend all your requirements, 2 layers of documentation, et cetera, et cetera. How am I doing? Yeah, finished up here. What's new? What's coming up? There's another set of standards out there for secure remote access, CIP 5 R6. I've got an X up there. There's a team that was briefed on a bunch of concerns by the government about VPN security. We developed an industry alert back in March of 2010. If you were a primary compliance point of contact, you received that. Hopefully the primary compliance contacts in the legal department were able to read that sufficiently and know they needed to hand it over to their IT and control system security people. I have to trust that happens, but that's the way we're set up in the industry. And it got down to the right technical people. As a reaction to that, NERC formed an urgent action SAR team to work on CIP 5 and to develop a new requirement 6 to talk about securing remote access into critical cyber assets inside electronic security perimeters. We've been out for a couple of industry votes now in the draft. We've not fared well. We had some pretty tight controls in there, what would be done, and I think we got as much as 40% of the industry to agree with the standards we have. That's a problem. We write good controls, we get 40% of the industry at max to agree. So I'm not sure exactly how we do that, but that's kind of the place we're at. CIP 2 version 3, sufficiency reviews is the next topic I've got on the list there for what's coming up next. You're going to say, well, why are we going back out and doing CIP 2 version 3 sufficiency reviews? Well, we've got another 24 to 36 months before we go on to the new standards. And so people are still using the risk-based assessment methodology, and there's still a lot of questions as to whether how effective, efficient it is at identifying that. So NERC is going to continue to send teams out to visit y'all and ask you to demonstrate how you went through your risk-based assessment methodology and what was in and what was out, and probably ask questions along the lines of some of the criteria you see in attachment 1 now as to what did fall in or did fall out, and why didn't you get that identified when you did it first? How come your risk-based assessment methodology misses that? They've been, and I'm going to talk publicly about a couple of companies they went to. I think they went to Dominion first, and it was called an audit. You see I got the word audit up there scratched out? They showed up to do a NERC sufficiency audit, CIP 2 sufficiency audit. And they showed up with their team, and they basically were shown the door because you can't come in and do an audit unless you're part of the compliance people. You haven't done notifications. Where's it in the compliance management enforcement program, et cetera, et cetera. And they said, look, you know, we're out here to make sure the program's working right. So they changed it from an audit to a review, and then they let them in the door. So they did the review at Dominion. Mark Ingalls from there did an extensive review in the public, so that's why I'm even talking about it, about what went right and what went wrong with that. They reworked their program. They went down, and I think they went to Duke on the next one, and it went a lot smoother. So they've been to Dominion, they've been to Duke, and they went to a third unit, which I can't identify because it's not been made public. I understand each year now they're going to visit probably 6 utilities. Mark Weatherford and the CIP team are going to be conducting those. It's not being done by compliance. It's not being done by standards. But it's the chief security officer is going out and basically doing a review to see how folks are doing and how effective they're doing at applying risk-based assessment methodology to come up with appropriate. Another good point for CARE is version 3 to version 4 transition. As you can imagine, you're going to have new assets identified and some assets going away. Again, the bookending of all your documentation up until those compliance periods, the very day One missed day of having documentation on board will result in violations, I can guarantee you. Therefore, pay attention, pay careful attention to how you document your compliance. And now getting back to Mike's question, what's going on with CIP 5? You can expect to see drafts and workshops in the second half of 2011. Right now, we're looking at I think a June workshop at a location yet to be determined to take a look at the new draft CIP 10 and 11. What's going to be in CIP 10 and 11? Don't know yet. I mean, we've got probably 75 to 80% of the controls written. We've gone back and taken every control that existed in CIP 3 through 9, went back to the Department of Homeland Security's compliance catalogs. We went through NIST 853, NIST 882, a couple other documents from NIST, and we're restructuring it. We're trying to restructure it in such a way that here are controls for transmission, here's controls for generation, here's controls for control centers, here are controls for large entities, small, or high, medium, and low risk. And so it's going to be like a matrix. It's not going to look like anything at all like what we're doing right now. Totally different. Is it going to be a CIP standards 3 through 9 with all that stuff interspaced? Yeah, sort of, maybe. But we're restructuring stuff. What we have in 3 through 9 doesn't work well, because originally when we started out with CIP version 1, we had 3 through 16, if you'll remember. And for political reasons or whatever, they went back from CIP 3 to 9. They combined a lot of stuff. That's how come you get this spaghetti work. If you've ever been a coder and done system development work and you're like memory constrained, you know you get a lot of spaghetti code, directed go-tos, multiple entry and exit points out of standards. That's kind of what CIP 2 through 9 or 3 through 9 look like today because of the structure it is. Because they took a lot and it wasn't politically acceptable to have 3 through 16, so they got 3 through 9. Well, we're looking now at trying to fix that, because my boss he gave me one criteria or one goal. He said, when you go to that standards team, get it fixed so we can make a change to one of the standards without having to change all the others. You know, it's an administrative thing, but that's, you know, and provide a good structure so you're not going to have to renumber and restructure everything again. Right now, if you add a standard or take a standard away, you can no longer leave. Like one of the things we did in CIP 5 is we took our 2.3, I think it was removed. And then there's a 2.4 and a 2.5 and a 2.6. Those all have to be now renumbered back to 2.3, 2.4, 2.5. And so you have that little cascading thing. Now, if you've got an automated compliance management system, you say, oh, no, I don't do that, because now I've got to go back and rework my compliance management system to realign to the new numbers you got for the same old standards. No real change, just numbering. Why can't you go through and say, our 2.3 removed or spare or reserved or something like that, so you don't mess up? That's not consistent with the NERC standards process. You cannot have that. Yeah, I've never seen an engineering document before where you lay out an architecture like that, and you know you're going to develop those for the next version, so you build the structure, and you don't have to go back and restructure it again. Yeah. And we ask, well, can we do that? No, that won't go through the standards process. So as a result of that, there's going to be a lot of renumbering the standards no matter what we do. Some people have voted no on the, or give us negative indications on the original standards because CIP 10 and 11 were different numbers, and they already spent a lot of money on compliance management systems. They didn't want to waste that invested effort. I understand that. But no matter what we do, it's going to be a total rework. CIP 10 is going to have high, medium, and low risk criteria, and then CIP 11 through whatever. CIP 11 may be the only standard and have all the requirements in there, or it may be CIP 10 or CIP 11 through 23, 24. I don't know. We're still working on that. If you're interested in getting a first-hand look, New York City, 3rd week of March, down at Con Ed is the next standards meeting. Go to the NERC website, sign up. You can either dial in and listen to the conversations. They're going to be talking about those various subjects, or you can dial in or actually go attend the meeting if you want. Public's invited. Comments are welcome. Observers are very welcome. They just ask you to register ahead of time so they'll have enough food for lunch. And with that, I'm going to wrap up. I think I'm probably over time a little bit. Yes, ma'am.
What do you see as the difference between security in a telecommunications environment and security in a utility environment? Or is security security? I don't know.
Well, I work both on the broadband switch side and the voice telco side at Sprint, two different entities at the time, but I did projects in both groups. And within the data networks and so forth, there's a much more greater appreciation because you're out there on the internet facing all the strangeness that goes on at the internet. So there's a greater awareness for the threat, I think, within the telecommunications folks. I think one of the biggest gaps and challenges we've got in the electric sector is the senior level executives do not understand the risks that we have and the threats that are posited against us. And anything you can do to get your senior executives in the electric sector out and exposed to what's happening in the threat world is great. Part of the problem is, in the telco world, we had lots of folks with clearances. I had a whole division at Sprint. We all had clearances working in government systems divisions. And I'm not just talking secret clearances for collateral. I'm talking about the good ones, that you can go in and really see the real stuff. And we worked within agencies. You know, we were embedded practically in some places with the government agencies we supported. You don't have that in the electric sector. There's not the understanding. There's not the awareness. So it's an education issue. I think the electric sector is probably about the same place that the phone companies and the data network folks were 10 years. Probably a 10-year gap there. The most mature group, believe it or not, in my mind, and I do a lot of work with various sectors, I think the financial sector's probably got the most mature security. And of course, that shouldn't surprise you because that's where the money's at, and they understand hackers getting in and stealing money for them, and they've got good risk management programs, and they do good ROI for evaluating what's cost effective and what's not. The telcos do a good job of that now too, and I think the electric sector needs to learn how to step up to that. We don't have people hacking into us like they do the telco sectors and stealing services or stealing money or billing information. What they steal from us is, in some cases, it's hard to quantify. They're stealing maybe electricity from us, or so as we move into AMI and stuff like that, we're going to have more concerns along those lines because now all of a sudden we've got personally identifiable information for customers sitting in AMI databases. I've got one of those now I have to protect, and all of a sudden, just like I had CLIA to worry about in the phone company for wiretaps and subpoenas and mandates and so forth from the government, I'm going to have to set something up like that now. If I got some government agency, FBI or whoever it might be, showing up and say, show us what's happening with the electricity usage out there at this customer's site, because we got some of that information here, or some of our utilities have it, and they're coming to us looking for information to point them there. You know, we're going to have to see a subpoena to provide that information now because it's customer identifiable information. And I don't think the electricity sector is really set up to handle subpoenas and things like that in real time like the phone companies were.